Hi, and welcome to the AAHOA Educational Experience. I'm Chip Rogers, and this week we're talking about the BP oil spill. Now, I know for many of you, that seems like a long time ago, but rest assured, this incredible man-made disaster is still having an enormous economic impact, not just on the southern states, not just the Gulf states, but really reverberating through our national economy. And we have some experts here today to talk about that. We will start to my right with Jay Patel, who is chairman and CEO of the LHS companies. Next to him is Wes Farrell, president of Farrell and Patel Attorneys at Law in Miami, and Ricky Patel, who is a partner with Farrell and Patel Attorneys at Law. So, gentlemen, as with most disasters, if you're not right next to it, it seems like a week or 2 weeks later, everybody goes back to their normal life. They forget about what's happening somewhere else in the country. But the reality is, we're almost to the 2-year mark of when this occurred, and this was a really, really big deal, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, Chip. First of all, thank you for inviting us here. This man-made disaster that happened April 20th, 2010, has been a economic impact as well as destroyed many families and many businesses in the last 20 months. While the history of BP and its subsidiary companies that created this mess, the first several months, the media really blew it up, and then they left. We've been here trying to clean up the mess. We've been here trying to figure out the economic impact that's been on businesses, including hotel owners. And when I say hotel owners, we're talking thousands of hotel owners from Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. So to paraphrase, the disaster is probably one of the worst disasters that we've had or that we have seen in our lifetime.
And this disaster, you brought up a great point, Jay. It's a man-made disaster. I'd almost, and we'll talk more about this later, almost characterize this as a media-made disaster on top of the man-made disaster.
Absolutely.
But Wes, let's stick with the man-made disaster. So unlike other oil spills, and the Exxon Valdez, and of course natural disasters like Katrina and some of the other things that have hit this country in the last few years, this was one where you just simply had a malfunctioning system, or something broke, and they were not in a position, BP, not in a position to fix it. And Americans just sat idly by watching oil pour out of the ocean floor.
It's a great point, Chip, and thank you for having us here today. I think that to put it in perspective, it's the largest oil spill in the United States, in the history of the United States. And to put it in further perspective, Exxon Valdez, which is the last modern oil spill that happened, it's over 10 times as large as Exxon Valdez. So the impact that it's had on the region, from Texas to Alabama to Mississippi to Louisiana and Florida, is very significant. We particularly have paid attention to the hospitality impact, and as you know, as many hotel owners know, travel is a business of perception, and as such, the perception of oil on the beaches of these coastal communities and even outlying regions was catastrophically impacted, and is still being impacted in many cases.
And when you have something go wrong in a business, Ricky, if the manager at the local fast food place does something stupid, he can get fired. No one really thinks anything about it, but we're talking about BP, British Petroleum, the 5th largest company in the world. And this was such a big deal that their CEO got fired. And that kind of shows that this wasn't just a little blip, a little mistake. This was big.
Sure, it was colossal. So we have Tony Hayward was fired or moved out of his position from the board. This wasn't the first time. If this were the first time, I believe the American people would be willing to forgive and work with them. This is not even the second or third. This has happened multiple times. And we're talking about the economic impact, which is very important. But let's go to one point, which were the deaths. We cannot allow American people who are working these jobs to die under these conditions just because a company wants to make a couple extra dollars. We go all the way back to 2005, where they had the Texas City explosion. The whole point of it was, do they want to save a couple $1 million? Now, when you're looking at the scale of it, I believe they were doing a little around $1 billion. They want to save a couple $1 million but they risked the lives of some of their loyal workers. These are people that are trying to make money for their families. These aren't the multi-million-dollar corporate owners of these businesses. It happened once. We worked with them, and it happened again. Now that time it was under a different CEO. I believe it was Lord Brown.
Right.
And now under Haywood, the same thing happened. We have to ask ourselves, how many times are we going to allow this to happen? How many people have to lose their lives? And how many businesses are going to have to go bankrupt before we understand that we must start putting these regulations in, and we must make job environments safer and prevent these companies from saving a dollar here or there.
So Ricky points out, Jay, and he makes a great case, this is a man-made disaster that probably could have been averted had BP taken the necessary precautionary steps to prevent this from happening, something that they have a history of a problem with. What bothers me, and I guess it has a direct impact on the economic dilemma that everyone faces now, is what was the media's response to it? We now live in a world where instant news all the time, 24/7, and you had this big oil spill, and unlike the Valdez where you understood what happened and boat hit something, now you have oil just coming up out of the ground, and I don't think we have a lot of experts, or at least the list of experts on that topic's got to be rather short.
Very.
So these people start warning of all these catastrophic things that could happen, and everyone talks about, the giant globs of oil are going to come up onto the beach, and you're going to sick, and people are going to die. And what does that do to everybody that depends on those beaches? I mean, so the media-made disaster was probably even bigger than the man-made disaster.
Absolutely true. I think the media response did more damage to the economic of the Gulf regions, tourism-wise, because a huge percentage of tourism is dependent on the Gulf regions. Obviously, we have the pristine white beaches all the way down to Texas, and the perception that the media gave and left that this was long-term, minimum 10 to 15 years, and it's just across the world, people just stopped coming.
But I think most people remember the Valdez, and you saw the poor seals with oil all over them,
Right.
but you weren't seeing that in Florida.
Well, keep in mind, Chip, too, that Exxon Valdez happened in Alaska.
Right.
Not to say Alaska didn't suffer, but the Gulf region is one of the most significant tourism areas in the entire country, for sure. Florida is by far the largest tourism state in the country, and it's so significant to this region, the fact that people travel not only from all around the country, but all around the world. We use the example that people abroad don't know the difference between the west coast of Florida and the east coast of Florida, just as much as people in America don't know where the radiation is going on in Japan. I just don't want to go to Japan, or people don't want to travel over there. They know that something's wrong, and they want to save their money, and they go to any of the other hundreds of very viable tourism destinations that exist throughout the world. And that's something that it's hard to track, hard to monitor, hard to really gauge the level of impact abroad, that people just didn't come here because they were going to come to Florida, they were going to come to the Gulf, and they just didn't.
So we have this man-made disaster followed up by what I'm now terming the media-made disaster, and the economic impact of everybody who relies on the Gulf Coast was enormous, as Wes just pointed out. I mean, this is not small business. This is big business. Tourism in the United States, and particularly in the Florida and the Gulf Coast region, all the way from Florida to Texas. And we're going to talk about that economic impact and what it really means in real dollars then and still today. So we've got a lot more to talk about on this issue of BP. Pretty interesting stuff. So join us coming up after the break. And welcome back to the AAHOA Educational Experience. I'm Chip Rogers, and this week we're talking about the BP oil spill almost 2 years later, but the continuing impact it is having on the Gulf Coast region, and of course that impact spreads all throughout the United States economy. In the first segment, Ricky, we talked about, we have this man-made, media-made issue that has damaged so many people, but if you don't live there and you're not part of that business community up and down the Gulf Coast, maybe you don't really understand it. But the reality is that this economic impact, yes, it hits tourism, it hits beach properties, it hits restaurants, it hits everything there, but it goes far beyond just those hotels you think of on the beach. It's the entire region that's been hit.
Sure. It's a great point about the media monster, as you stated. So the one thing is, with the media, everyone has been quick to blame the media for the effects. The media they were doing their job. They were reporting, but it was the misconception. It was kind of like the Chinese whispers, correct?
Right.
And that Chinese whispers, right as it got to Europe and all these other places, we started having problems. I'll give you an example. Someone from France that takes their annual trip to the Gulf Coast with their family is now seeing high definition videos of oil spewing all over the place, right? So you have to think to yourself, if you're in France, do you know what the difference is between Pensacola, Fort Myers, and Fort Lauderdale? I mean, most people don't, right? Better than take a risk, even if it's a couple percent chance that there's oil on the beach. Let's check out Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, or Cancun, Mexico. So the effects are there initially when they go to these other locations, but here's the big problem. The following year, they had such a good time at this other location, they may not come back. So the immediate effect is the cancellations. The long-term effect is people just not going back to these areas. I mean, there's too many problems. You know, you're hearing about hurricanes and everything else. Now there's oil over the beaches. You know, forget it. Let's try somewhere else. And it really affects these mom and pop restaurants, hotels, and all these other fantastic businesses that have done well in these areas.
So Jay, you know, when you see the television coverage of this and you see the giant Westin hotel right there on the beach, and you think about the nice beachside restaurants, I think for most people, both in America and even internationally, that's what they sense. Well, yeah, those people they're going to get hurt. But the reality is that pain spread far beyond just those hotels and those restaurants there on the beach.
Well, you know, tourism is one of the economic drivers in the Gulf region. And the perception that there's a chance there will be oil, as Ricky said, has made significant impact. And I'll give you two examples. Hilton, when we met with them, last year's revenue in Mexico, they're up by 24%. Now the last time they saw those numbers was 15 years ago. So clearly tourism is not coming to the Gulf region, they're going to Mexico. Last January, out of the 50 states, 49 states had snow. When an impact of that type of weather hits, tourism increases in Florida, especially with snowbirds. We were again flatlined. So the economic impact has now spread throughout the world, not to take a chance. Unfortunately, we're stuck with that burden. And even on the impact side this year, some of our regions are doing worse than we did last year, 2010.
And Wes, talk about that for a second, because there may be some who say, well, okay, you had a little downturn on the beachside properties, but they're back up now, so everything's fine. But just ignoring the economic impact of everybody else, you can't do that.
It's ludicrous to do that. I mean, in recently, you've seen a lot of information that local businesses have recovered, and it's not a fair statement, because you can't look at something in a vacuum. You can't look at somebody who's experienced 20 straight months of maybe 20-30% losses in revenue, and then say 1 month, say July, this past summer, they're back to where they were before the spill and say they've recovered. They've sustained 20 straight months, and we don't know what they're going to do in August. We don't know what they're going to do, but they're reporting on it in July that everything's back to normal. Well, that's not fair, because this person, you don't know all the costs that this hotel owner had to endure to get back to that point, to even be still in business. You know, and a part of our due diligence in preparation for this case, we've enlisted the services of many experts, economists and forensic accountants and forensic experts in the hospitality industry to help us understand the impact of this kind of thing. There's been many studies done, both by BP, by the Gulf Coast Claims Facility, which is the $20 billion fund that was set up to help pay people. I'm sure we'll talk about that a little later. But through their analysis, and through our analysis particularly, we've seen that there is, without a doubt, an effect to all areas outside. When people go to the coast, they don't just drive to the beach and just stay on the beach. Not everybody can afford to stay on the beach. And how do you get to the beach? You have to stop at gas stations. You have to stop at restaurants. You have to stop at all these other businesses along the way that are dependent upon that coastal community, dependent upon that business, dependent upon that tourism. And when that tourism goes away, all these businesses suffer. And I think the data we have, the data that we've spent tremendous resources to compile, shows that unquestionably.
Ricky, how do you make the case, and I'm sure someone's going to ask you to make this case,
Right.
of determining what is the impact, the economic impact of the disaster versus the economic impact of just an economy that's been struggling?
Chip,
And how do you differentiate?
I had a feeling you were going to ask that question. This has to be the number one question that I hear, especially in the hotel industry. Well, it was the economy that affected our properties. It was this. We sit down and we start looking at their numbers at their property. Okay, we start looking at 2007, 2008, 2009, and then we realize that at 2009, it was the worst year in 75 years hospitality industry, right? So if you're at the bottom, there's only one way to go, and that's to come back up. Outside of the Gulf region, a lot of people started seeing that swing, okay? The whole thing was, this oil spill really was that straw that broke the camel's back. But now we don't know when that there's going to be any type of recovery. If the economy is slow, there's ways to stimulate it. But when there's a disaster, and a man-made disaster that can be toxic, we don't know the effects of this. We really don't. The effects we know right now is there was oil spilled everywhere. This oil a lot of it has been sunk to the ground. We don't know what type of chemicals were used. We don't know what is going to happen later on. So if this were merely an economic argument of, well, the economy was bad, people were not traveling, that's one thing. But let me ask you this. Why is it that so many comparative markets, we've used, I believe, Smith Travel Research, and all these other fantastic data analysis services that have shown us, outside of the Gulf, people are actually coming out of this, okay? Here's the best way, though. We went back, and this is the way that gets people. We asked them about their cancellations. Well, look at your cancellations in 2010 after the oil spill. What happened? And that's when that light bulb goes on, and people realize, you know what? We thought it was this. This is really what's been keeping us down. So there's multiple factors that we can, but it's a great question that always comes up. And after we explain all of the different factors, they realize that, you know what, this wasn't merely just the economy.
And really almost, I mean, it's sad to say you had I remember the movie a few years ago, The Perfect Storm. You did have a declining economy, which everyone was bracing for. And then this piled on top of it, a disaster that no one had ever seen. Wow, I don't know how you, and sorting it out is to say, you know, how do you determine what is what? It's got to be very difficult, but cancellations is a good way to look at it.
Sure.
Yeah. Who says I'm not coming back? And that's a pretty good way to measure.
Well, also one more thing. We're right now fighting the perception that BP is saying everything is fine, everything is back to normal. They just released a media ad where members of the Gulf Coast are fighting to say who had the best economy this year. And while we were able to compile numbers from the taxing authorities, while 2 of the zip codes in our area was up by 34 to 40%, but the other 7-8 zip codes were down by 10%, 17, and even 31% from last year. So these zip codes are less than 5 to 7 miles off the coast.
Wow.
So you can see the huge impact on it.
Well, we are out of time for this particular show, but we're not out of time for talking about the impact of the BP oil spill, what it has meant to the hospitality industry, not just in the Gulf Coast, but as it reverberates through the economy. And we'll do that in our next show, so make sure to join us. If you have any questions or would like to contact me, you can reach me, chip@AAHOA.com. That's chip@AAHOA.com. So for Ricky Patel and Wes Farrell and Jay Patel, thank you for being with us. So long. We'll see you again next week.